To be honest, I'm really sad to make this video, but I think it's something we have to talk about. Sometimes, writers, you've got to throw away your book. Yeah. Like the whole book. And just so you know, I have thrown away a novel, so I feel your pain, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. In this video, I'm gonna act a little bit like a literary therapist and coach you through the 5 steps that you should ask yourself when and if you should throw away your novel. The first step is acceptance of the possibility. This stage matches the stages of grief when you lose a loved one. The very first step is always denial. In fact, you may be watching this video and you're working on a novel and maybe it's not going so well, but you still say, I would never throw it away. A lot of beginning writers refuse to believe that after working on something for years and years and years, they could just throw it by the wayside and never let it see the light of day. I think that instinct toward denial is so strong because in a way it makes you feel like you're admitting you're stupid. If you throw a novel away, it's somehow proof that you're not cut out to be a writer. And so understandably, throwing a novel away is one of the most terrifying things that you could do as an author. But nearly every writer I know and nearly every famous writer that you've ever read has thrown away a novel. Throwing away a novel isn't a rare event. It's not an exception. It's kind of more like the rule. If you are 15 or 20 or 25 years into your writing career and you've never thrown away a novel, I would actually say you are more of the exception rather than the rule. So to make you feel a little less bad about yourself, let's take a look at some famous novelists who ended up throwing away a novel. Michael Chabon worked for 5.5 years on his second novel, which was called Fountain City, and it was supposed to be a follow-up to his first excellent novel, The Mysteries of Pittsburgh. But he never ended up finishing it, and he has never to this day published it. He abandoned it. 5.5 years. Whoosh. Now, you probably know Donna Tartt because she got an enormous amount of accolades from publishing The Secret History, her very first novel. But her second novel, which she just calls the New York novel, she couldn't pull it off. She worked on it for a few years and then ended up abandoning it to write The Little Friend, which ended up being her second novel. And after writing Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling was actually stuck for a while. And she tried to write an adult novel, worked on it for a while, but couldn't pull it off. She's never told us the title, she's never told us the details, but we just know before she wrote The Casual Vacancy, she was working on another project that she ended up shelving. Really, I could go on and on and on. John Updike, he abandoned a book called Willow. Junot Diaz abandoned a book called Dark America. Jennifer Egan abandoned a book called Inland Souls. Listen, beginner writers think, that'll never happen to me. Experienced writers know it's not if, but when. So now we're to the second step, which is, how do you know? Because if you're gonna throw away a novel, you really have to know, right? You can't just like be guessing and be like, I think those 2 years of my life I'm just gonna toss in the wastebasket. So I'm gonna list 7 different reasons why it might be the right choice to abandon this novel and move on to another project. 1, when you stop believing in the concept. Now, you could stop believing in the concept at any point, right? You could have finished chapter 1, you could be midway through the book, or even you could have finished the whole book. But I will say most of the time that this happens, you are between chapter 4 and chapter 8 or so, right? You're midway through the book. And sometimes you just end up not feeling it anymore or falling out of love with the idea of this book. Michael Crichton had a book called Pirate Latitudes about these 17th century pirates in the Caribbean. And when they were going through his computer after his death, they like randomly found this file. He had written half of it and then he just sort of gave up on it. And for whatever reason, I think he just realized like, you know what? This isn't the book I'm supposed to be writing. I should be writing something else. And kudos to him for making that difficult decision and moving onward, because if you look at the history of his books, man, he has a great run of bestsellers. Number 2, you realize it has a fundamental flaw. Sometimes you just sense when a book isn't working, right? You're like, I've got these characters, I've got an idea of a plot, but for some reason, the magic isn't happening. And sometimes you think, I've got to guess at how I might fix this, but also you think it might take more time to fix this than to actually write another novel. I do think if you start with a good initial idea, it's easier to write a book than if you take an initially flawed idea and then halfway through, you try to rejigger it so it actually works better. Reconceptualizing a book is much harder work than most people think it is. Tolstoy actually recognized a fundamental flaw about one of his books called The Decembrists. It was about the Decembrist uprising of 1825, and he had written a good chunk of it, and then he was just like, you know what? This book doesn't work. It's fundamentally flawed. So he abandoned it, and you know what he wrote next? War and Peace. Ooh. Ooh, I think that was a good decision. Basically, he realized that the story he wanted to tell was the story before the Decemberist uprising. So the very end of War and Peace would basically be where the Decemberist uprising starts. But you see how abandoning that novel led to a much better outcome than he could have possibly dreamed of. He wrote one of the foundational pillars of world literature. Number 3, when another book gets in the way. Stephen King has a half-finished novel called The Plant. Basically, a guy gets rejected by a publishing house and then he gives them an ivy plant that sort of takes over the publishing house and demands human sacrifice in exchange for wild success. He actually wrote a good chunk of it. He put it up online. He said you could donate if you want to read it. But then other stories got in the way. He just realized there are other books that are more important than this, that will be better than this. Now, if you're one of those people that get distracted very easily and you're always like, squirrel, 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 then you want to be wary of this one because you don't want to abandon a novel really easily and just jump to the next new project. You have to be really, really sure that you're not meant to write this book and you really want to write the next book. But hey, Stephen King did it. It might be the right decision for you too. Number 4, when you don't think you can finish it. There are all sorts of reasons why you don't think you can finish a novel. Maybe you got lost in the storyline, maybe it ballooned into something much larger than you thought it would be and you don't know how to tie all the strands together. And once again, even the best writers experience this. Ernest Hemingway wrote a book called The Garden of Eden for 15 years without ever figuring out how to actually pull the ending together. It's about a man and his wife who both fall in love with the same woman. Now, after his death, they ended up publishing a small portion of it, about 1/3 of what he'd actually written, but he was never able to finish the novel. Number 5. Wheel spinning. How long have you been wrestling with your work in progress? 2 years? 3 years? 5 years, 7 years, 10 years? At what point do you say, okay, I've wasted enough time on this, I just need to move on to a next book? The trouble is the more time that you spend, the more difficult it is to tear yourself away from the novel. This is the fallacy of sunk costs. The more time you put into a novel, the more reluctant you are to abandon that novel. But I would say that ironically enough, the more time you spend on a book without being able to fix it, the higher the likelihood is that perhaps it's not fixable. There are clearly exceptions to that, and hey, you might be an exception to that rule. I'm just saying that's a general principle. Number 6, when your beta readers, agent, or publishers hate it. Sometimes their feedback just allows you to revise, right, and to fix the novel, but sometimes their issues with the book are so integral or foundational to the structure of the book, you're like, I would have to change everything about this book and rewrite it from scratch if I actually wanted to publish this. Now, sometimes those people can be wrong, right? There's plenty of examples of people hating books that went on to do really, really well in the marketplace, but sometimes they're not wrong. Truman Capote had a book called Answered Prayers. He really struggled with finishing it. His publisher, as an incentive, actually upped his advance money to $1 million, which today would be something like $4 or $5 million. And he tried publishing little excerpts of it, and everyone around him just absolutely hated it. And perhaps because of that feedback, he never ended up finishing the novel, even though it would have been a huge payday. I think he sensed that the book would be a failure, and so he decided, okay, I'd rather not publish that book than publish it and have it be a huge flop. And number 7, when the market won't accept it. I have a friend who wrote a novel about Native Americans. She is not Native American. So when she started floating it to agents and her publishers wouldn't touch it because of the whole ideology of own voices and the fact that she wasn't Native American. That was a completed book, and if you love the book, yes, you can always self-publish it. But then you run the risk of getting a bunch of bad reviews from readers because they have standards about own voices as well. So whether you're wedded to traditional publishing or whether you're self-publishing, there are writers who abandon the book at this stage. Okay, so those are the 7 reasons, and your reasons might be a combination of many of those reasons. Now, I told you at the beginning of this video I've thrown away a novel. It's true, I have. I threw away a completed novel. Now, why did I end up throwing it away? For one reason is I didn't read it for about a year and I sort of fell out of love with it. After a while, I could see its flaws more clearly. In the end, there were sections of it that I really loved, but I also thought the book as a whole wasn't as good as I could make it. And when I read books along similar themes like The Queen's Gambit, I realized they nailed that particular storyline and I could see more clearly the flaws in my own story. And so what did I do? I just ended up writing another novel, and now I'm currently sending that one out. I know it sounds so flippant, like, oh, you just write another novel. But I mean, that's kind of what we do as writers, right? I know it seems like an insurmountable hump to get over, but it is what we do, and you're gonna write another one eventually, so go for it. The third step in figuring out whether to throw away a novel is to exercise caution. I am not telling you to treat this decision flippantly, right? right? Like you think, you know what? I don't like this book, and you just throw it in the trash can or put it in your deleted files, and you're like, okay, let's move on to the next thing. No. This is not a flippant decision. Obviously, your first step should be to take a break, right? Just let the manuscript rest for a while. Sometimes you need a little distance between yourself and it before you can see it a little more clearly and see what you need to do to fix it. Sometimes that pause will help you recalibrate. Sometimes your unconscious needs some time to work on the story. Harper Lee threw her manuscript out a window into the snow. She was fed up with it. She thought, I can't write this. Before a neighbor convinced her to like, no, go outside, get the pages, you're not throwing that away. Or Stephen King threw Carrie in the trash before his wife retrieved it and saved the manuscript. So the message here is, don't throw it in the trash too quickly. 2, you might want to ask an editor or a friend to read it and see what you have so far. So as an editor, I've actually read a good amount of half-finished novels because people will get stuck, they won't know what to do, and they'll ask me to give them feedback on what they've written so far. And usually I can help them with, okay, these are the avenues that the story should develop in. And at least of the ones that I've worked on, I haven't read any and said, oh, like you need to abandon this. Almost all the time I can see, all right, here's how this story would develop in really good and functional ways. A third thing you should do to exercise due caution is to make sure you're open to radical revisions. There are so many authors who rewrite their entire book from a different point of view. They wrote it in third person, now they're writing it in first. Or they wrote it in the view of the neighbor, and now they're writing it from the view of the mother. You have to be open to the potential that this book might require a ton of work for it to actually function well as a novel. But it's completely fine to do all that work as long as you think this is the right path forward for this story. The fourth step in exercising due caution is simply to think of alternative genres. If it's not working as a novel, might it work as a screenplay or as a graphic novel? My friend who wrote the book about Native Americans, she's actually going to try to turn it into a screenplay. And then my last point about exercising due caution is if this is your first novel, it's usually better to go ahead and finish it. I do see some writers end up on a hamster wheel of writing half of a novel, abandoning it, writing a couple chapters, abandoning it. And so they end up with 6 or 7 half-finished novels, and they never actually do the hard work, because it is harder work to write the second half of a book than the first half of a book. They never end up doing that hard work and completing a book. If that's you, if you have a pattern of not finishing, then I would say you probably just need to push through and do whatever you can to at least get a full manuscript. Now, once you have that full manuscript, you might decide, okay, like I can't go anywhere with this. Like the book doesn't work. But at least you have a book you can evaluate. You can't evaluate half of a manuscript very well. The fourth step in deciding whether to throw away a book is why not just self-publish it? When a novel isn't working, a lot of authors tell me, well, even if I don't get it traditionally published, like why don't I just go ahead and self-publish it? They would rather self-publish than throw it in the trash. And I totally get that. And just side note, we're obviously talking about finished books here, right? Not, half-finished books. So I would say yes. I mean, some of the time self-publishing is the right move at that stage. But there are some obvious dangers to publishing a book that has some serious flaws in it. One, the term debut novel is a very magical term. It helps a lot with marketing. If you already self-publish your book, then your second book's not going to have that debut sort of enchantment around it. 2, if you already have a fan base, then by publishing a book which quite isn't up to stuff, you risk alienating your fan base. And books don't get erased, right? They live forever out there. There's always some book of yours on someone's bookshelf and you can't go out and take that back. So just be careful about what you publish. There's no takesies backsies. Did I just make that up? I think I just made that up. Also, when you publish a book, it establishes a track record for you and people can see sales. And if you have a book that isn't very good, you don't want to put that foot forward and try to get sales off a book which is flawed because it'll get bad reviews and it won't sell a lot of copies. And that's on your permanent author record. And the last thing I'll say about self-publishing is sometimes it shortchanges the ideas you have for revision. Like say you self-publish and then a year later you're like, oh, I know what to do with this book now. You cannot use that epiphany because, hey, it's already out there, right? There's no revisions that you can make. Now, here's one other option that I'd like to present for you. Say you've written half of a book and instead of, publishing it, because you can't publish half the book, as a way to incentivize yourself, you serialize it. So you publish that first chapter and then you say to your fans, okay, every single week I'm going to publish one more chapter. Especially if fans end up liking it, there's going to be an enormous amount of pressure for you to be like, okay, I gotta figure out what's happening in the rest of this book. And sometimes getting feedback from people on the first half of the book helps you figure out what the narrative should be for the second half. Now the last step, it's gonna come as a bit of a shock, but it is number 5, the benefits of throwing away a novel. I know that seems oxymoronic. You're like, wait, abandoning a whole book and there are benefits to that? Seriously? But I would just like to say to you that yes, you can find a silver lining. All that time is not wasted. My first point is by writing this, you improved your writing skills. Those skills aren't magically taken away if you abandon the novel and don't publish it. You still have ownership over your improvements. You are a better writer of dialogue, of description, of pacing. You have improved through this process. 2, sometimes you can cannibalize a certain character or a certain scene and use it in the next book. So it doesn't mean you're throwing away the entire thing. Sometimes it can inspire the next story you want to tell. 3, some of the time you can come back 5 years or 10 years in the future and you're like, okay, I know how to write this story again. And that was just your first effort. Think of Harper Lee and how her novel, Go Set a Watchman, which she ended up not publishing until I think people took advantage of her and published it for her. But she didn't publish that because it was like the prototype for To Kill a Mockingbird. And To Kill a Mockingbird was 1,000 times better. I am so glad that Harper Lee chose to abandon that Go Set a Watchman book and instead write To Kill a Mockingbird. And the best benefit of throwing away a novel is oftentimes you'll look back 5 years later, 10 years later, and you're like, I'm really glad I didn't publish that because it was kind of terrible. A lot of authors look back at their early work and they're kind of embarrassed. I don't really think about my chess novel anymore, but when I do, I'm actually grateful that I didn't end up publishing it. Okay, I know a lot of parts of this video might have been depressing to you, and for that, I'm sorry. But the sooner you can make a decision to abandon a writing project, the sooner you can move on to the next project.